Example of the Height report, which demonstrated several poor methods for taking samples and drawing conclusions upon those. In this video, we're going to look at names for some of those common mistakes in sampling. So the general idea that we'll be looking at is this idea of biased methods. And by biased, we just mean that it has a tendency or a pattern of producing untrue values. Now, bias can come in two forms. One, measurement bias, and two, sampling bias. Measurement bias is when the bias comes from the actual instrument or technique that you're using. So if you have a physical instrument for measuring concentration or weight, you often have to calibrate those instruments. So that might, if it's not calibrated correctly, it might produce values that are systematically higher or lower than they should be. So I'll maybe make that comment, instrument not calibrated. And if you're in the social sciences, your instrument is often a survey, and maybe your survey has leading questions in it. So those leading questions cause people to provide answers more in one way than another just based on the wording of the question. So I'll add that idea as well, leading questions. And there are other ways that measurement bias can come about, but just understand the idea that it's your method of measuring causes to record values that are off one direction or another consistently and not representing truly what's going on. Now, the second method or area where bias might occur is this idea of sampling bias. Now, this is different. This is based on who or what where our data is coming from. Or in other words, the sample is not representative of the whole population. So this Height report definitely had some of each of these going on. For example, there were leading questions in the survey that caused people to answer one way or another. But then also the sample that was collected, the survey was sent to women's groups and counseling centers. Those were not representative of the population, so there was also sampling bias in her study. Now, some common forms of sampling bias include using methods of voluntary sampling, convenient sampling, and this idea of survivorship bias. So let's look at each of these. Voluntary sampling is exactly what it sounds like. People are not required to respond. You volunteer your responses or your participation. The drawback of this is that people with strong feelings, one way or the other, are the ones that tend to respond. If you're a bit ambivalent about a situation, you're probably not going to take the time to respond. But if you have very strong feelings, you will take the time to give your feedback. So you might see things like on product reviews. You'll notice they're often, all 4s and 5s, these are awesomes, or with a sprinkling of 1s, this is the worst product, never buy this. So they're kind of the two extremes. You don't see a lot of reviews in the middle. Also, another one that's kind of funny to look at, rate my professor. Not required to fill those out, but if you look at the feedback there, it's all either gushing this person is wonderful or avoid this person at all cost. It's very rarely, well, this person was fine, okay, standard. You don't see many of those, amazing or terrible. You see the two extremes. So, and you could probably think of some other examples here. A way to help with issues with voluntary sampling is maybe to include an incentive or some kind of prize for trying this. So you've seen that in emails. Fill out this survey and you can enter in a drawing to win an iPad. And that's their attempt to draw more people from the middle ground. Convenient sampling is when you only sample a convenient group. And that's going to leave out a lot of subgroups. So kind of a corny example, but maybe I was going to take a survey and I, for some reason, love hanging out at the mall by the pretzel shop. So I go there at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning and I order a bunch of pretzels and just sit and eat them and collect some data. So it's convenient and comfortable. But the problem is the only people passing by at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning are probably going to be individuals who don't have to work during the week. You're going to miss out on huge segments of the population. So I don't think I need to spell that out. You can think of lots of segments of the population you might be missing there. And then the last one is the idea of survivorship bias. So it's this idea of focusing on those who made it, the survivors. But if you do that, you're missing out on a lot of information on those that did not make it, those that did not survive. If you search this online, there's all kinds of interesting examples, some of them humorous, not so much, but lots of interesting examples of this. But probably the most famous one is this idea during World War II. They were studying damage done to aircraft after missions and said, hey, we need to add some armor on these parts that were most frequently damaged. Thankfully, statistician Abram Wald stepped in and said, hold on, you're only looking at the planes that made it back. That suggests that if they get damaged heavily in these areas, they can still make it back. So don't waste your time on armor there. Put it on the opposite parts, because those are the planes that did not make it back. So again, poor sampling and biased results can come from two ways. Your instrument, the measurements you're taking, can be biased, or your sample can be biased and not representative of the entire population. In the next section, we're going to look at one of the most basic techniques for taking a representative sample, and then move on to some variations of that technique.